Hey everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I'm Sian and I make content around crime, horror, and just anything I find scary and want to share with you. So today we're going to be going through quite a grim case. It's definitely one of the darkest and most disturbing cases of family abuse I've ever heard of. In 2012, Australian authorities discovered a case so horrifying that their practices spanned 5 generations. This case was known as the Colt family incest case. This shocking discovery revealed a legacy of incest, neglect, and family abuse that just left me so shocked. Before we get started, I do just want to mention that due to legal reasons, the real identities of the family members involved are still unknown to the public. So all of the names I will be using are fake names, even the surname of the family, which is Colt. Colt is a pseudonym used by the New South Wales court and government agencies just to protect the family's identities. With that said, let's get started. This is the case of the Colt family incest. In July of 2012, Australian authorities were tipped off about a very shocking case of incestuous abuse in a very rural part of New South Wales. The investigation began shortly after a child at a local primary school overheard a really disturbing conversation. Another child had spoken about a very unkempt girl living in the bush who was pregnant with a baby fathered by her very own brother. Even more horrifying, the girl mentioned that one of her sisters was also pregnant, but she had no idea which brother was the father of this baby. Obviously, that sparked a lot of interest and a lot of confusion by some of the kids at the school, and eventually this came out to the authorities, and this is where the case started. Authorities began to track down the Colt family, who were living in an extremely remote part of New South Wales. What they found was beyond anything they had expected or ever really experienced. Nearly 40 family members, all victims of inbreeding, were living together in these very rural, very makeshift shelters on this farm with no running water, no sanitation, or access to the outside world. They were completely cut off. This case was immediately flagged as something a little bit more serious as just simple neglect. And as the authorities dug deeper and deeper, it just became all the more sinister. So I just want to speak a little bit about the Colt family tree and the fact that they had a whole 5 generations of incest. They have a very complicated and very disturbing family tree.
First video, I actually just decided to go have a look at the family tree. So it looks like Tim and June, the original starters of the Colt clan, had 7 kids, and then these kids obviously had more kids, and even from those kids, there were more kids born. The yellow is kids who were born from like parent-child or full sibling relationships, and the ones highlighted purple were born from like half siblings, nieces, aunts, nephews, grandparents, grandchild relationships, etc. So that's about 50% of all the children were born as a result of inbreeding or incest. And that's not to say the other kids weren't. The results were just kind of unknown. Like they either weren't released to the public or the police maybe decided not to do DNA tests on these kids. It very well could be that every single child born was one born out of the inbreeding. But there were also some cases where some of the kids would go work on a different farm and then they would have relationships with the people working on that farm of a sexual nature, and then kids could also be born from that.
The family's origins originally trace back to New Zealand, where June Colt, which is the original mother, was born in 1948. She herself was actually the product of brother-sister incest. In 1966, she married Tim Colt, who was born in 1943, and together they had 7 children. They were named Martha, Frank, Paula, Cherry, Rhonda, Betty, and Charlie, obviously all pseudonyms. In the 1970s, the family moved to Victoria, Australia. Over the next decades, their family grew to nearly 40 members. Unfortunately, these children were being born into a cycle of incest that has persisted for generations, 5 to be exact. Siblings were having children with one another, and those children grew up to repeat the exact same cycle. This just resulted in a very tangled web of genetic relationships, and as we all know, inbreeding can cause a lot of problems for the children who were born into it. By the time the authorities intervened in 2012, it was clear that these children were the result of incestuous relationships between parents, siblings, grandparents, and even cousins. Many of the children were very malnourished and had serious developmental delays. They also showed some physical abnormalities linked to all of the generations of incest. So the conditions that the Colt family lived in were almost beyond what any of us watching this video now would be able to comprehend. Imagine a family of nearly 40 people living in filthy makeshift shelters very deep in the bush on a very remote farm without running water, electricity, and proper sanitation. The children found in the property had rarely bathed, wore really dirty, tattered clothing, and were severely malnourished. Beyond all of the physical neglect, the mental and emotional toll was way worse. These children were part of a deeply rooted generational cycle of family abuse. They had no formal education. Many of them were unable to speak properly, and some didn't even know who their biological parents were. DNA testing later revealed that many of these children were born as a result of parent-child or sibling-sibling relationships. This was a family that had lived in isolation for decades. The lines between parent, sibling, cousin had become disturbingly blurred, even though they were all related. Now we're just going to dive into the investigation. The question is, how did the authorities unravel the full extent of this case? So the investigation didn't stop with the discovery of the family. Investigators discovered a series of very disturbing text messages of a sexual nature that Betty had sent to her son. Even more disturbingly, Betty and her son Bobby, the one that she was sending the text messages to, had been making plans to abduct another family member, Billy, from foster care. Despite the very clear evidence of family abuse, this case was made complicated by the victim's reluctance to come forward. Many of the family members denied any sense of wrongdoing, and the isolation they had endured had blurred their understanding of what normal relationships are supposed to be like in a normal family. The lines of consent were also quite blurred. This case has been described as very unique, not just because of the generational incest, but because it highlighted a deeper moral and legal issue. Even though the victims in the family believed that they had consented to all of their relationships, the law still deems such acts as criminal. So what happened next? After the children were rescued from the Colt family's remote compound, they were placed in protective custody. For many of these children, it was sadly their first time being introduced to basic things such as clean clothes, regular meals, and formal education. But for the adults involved, the legal consequences were quite murky. Because of the complex relationships within the family and the victim's reluctance to testify, it was difficult to determine the guilt of the individual offenders. In some cases, it was even hard to prove who the biological parents were of these kids. Many family members denied the abuse or even tried to evade questioning altogether. Some family members were arrested while others disappeared, possibly trying to escape justice altogether. Even today, the full extent of the abuse may never be known. So one of the questions asked by many people was, how could this case go on for so long without being noticed? So the Colt family had lived in isolation for decades, moving from one remote location to the other while still hiding all of their family abuse. Their very intense separation from society was the reason that no one really found out what was happening. It wasn't just their isolation that contributed to the secrecy, it was also the reluctance of neighbors and officials to intervene. Red flags had been raised for years. Reports of children living in unsanitary conditions, unkempt and very malnourished. But it wasn't until the disturbing conversation overheard at the primary school that the official investigation was opened. So I don't really understand why authorities didn't think to intervene when there were reports of children being malnourished and kept in really unsanitary conditions. I feel like that was the perfect opportunity for authorities to intervene. I feel like if the authorities had chosen to intervene earlier, some of the inbreeding could have been stopped. This case was also very unique because of the victim's psychological conditioning after being in this family for so many years. Many of the children and adults in the Colt family didn't understand that their relationships were abusive or illegal. Growing up in an environment where incest and inbreeding and family abuse was so normalized made it nearly impossible for them to recognize the need to escape. It's really so sad to me that these children had no idea what a normal family functions like. And the awful thing is, when these children were brought into foster care or even adopted, there were still instances where the children showed signs of wanting to be sexual with the family members or the foster care workers, which shows that it was so normalized in their brains that being sexual with people you're supposed to consider family is so normal. All I can think about is the fact that it's going to take years and years of therapy for these kids to unlearn these behaviors. And even still, I think it will have an effect on them for the rest of their lives, which is also really sad. This Colt family incest case was definitely one of the most disturbing cases I've ever come across. The fact that they were so hidden away in such a remote part of Australia makes it all the worse. This family just lived in a world of their own, a world where incest and abuse was normalized, and it was passed down like a toxic legacy between all of the generations. And if this poor child had not said anything about her sister being pregnant with her brother's child, the authorities wouldn't have intervened, and who knows how many more generations this would have carried on for. This case is just a reflection of how societal neglect, isolation, and silence can allow horrors like these to just continue being unchecked. Even though the family has now been separated and many of the children are receiving the care and love that they so dearly need, the scars left by this abuse will never truly fade. I would love to hear your thoughts on this case. Please comment down below if you have anything that you would like to share, and please don't forget to alert authorities if you hear or see anything remotely similar to this. As we've now seen, the family was not going to stop this, so we need to be the people who put an end to behaviors like this. Anyways, please go grab a nice warm cup of tea, have a snack, rub a dog after hearing of this really disturbing case, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of your day. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it. And if you enjoy this kind of content, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. I'll see you guys next week.